Welcome back, everybody, to parts 3 and 4 of Extra History's Admiral Yi. This is one of those topics that, as I mentioned at the beginning of episode 1 yesterday, I don't know a lot about, but man, I am excited to find out more about this guy's story. There is obviously a reason that he's a national hero in Korea. There's a reason that he's on their money, that he's remembered so fondly. He's really kind of ranked right up there with the ranks of Horatio Nelson as far as great naval commanders of the past. And I have been fascinated already by his story, so we are ready to dive into parts 3 and 4 today. Please make sure you go out and check out the original content creator. I'll put a link in the description to part 3, and then you can watch from there. I'll also put a link in the description to parts 1 and 2 of my reaction. If you did not see those, check them out. And if you like what you see, please consider subscribing to the channel. We add about 1,000 to 2,000 new subscribers every day. It's a fantastic community. I just happen to be the face of the community, but there are tens of thousands of history lovers here, all who have something positive to add, and I'm glad to have you as part of that community. Let's dive into part 3.
The king had fled from Seoul. The court was making the arduous trek to Pyongyang. Half of Korea was already in Japanese hands. Yi Il, the very same man who had once tried to pass his negligence off to Yi Sun-shin, was the commander of the Korean army. His forces were routed in battle after battle. Essential fortifications and choke points were abandoned, surrendered with barely a fight. Then, in the Battle of Cheongju, the regular Korean forces, under the command of a man named Shin-rip, were annihilated. This is the moment that forces the king to abandon his capital. This is the moment that leads many to fear that Korea as a nation may not survive. But on the very same day that the king fled from his seat, Admiral Yi was destroying the Japanese fleet in Okpo Harbor. Hope for the nation lived in a handful of ships plying the coast. For 3 weeks after Okpo, Yi gathered charts, scouted out the enemy fleet, and waited for his secret weapon, the turtle ship, to arrive.
So some of you mentioned that, hey, this is kind of like the precursor to ironclads, this turtle ship that's got this. I don't know what the armor was made of on the top, but I'm going to go ahead and assume it wasn't some kind of wood. In fact, I think we might have to look this up because I'm curious to know a little bit more about these turtle ships. So this is pretty cool. They've actually got some examples of them here. I'm going to drag this over to the side so you can see it a little better. They've got one that's actually restored that you can see. And this is really cool. And it is little iron spikes on top. They were definitely made of metal on the top. And here's the grave of Admiral Yi here. So that's pretty cool that you can go see that today. So it says, was the turtle ship really the world's first armored battleship? So yeah, it's kind of a gray area, obviously, because the sides of the ship were not armored. But the top certainly was. So that's pretty cool, fascinating. There weren't a lot of them that were made, but you can obviously see why they could be so fearsome on the battlefield. They'd be difficult to impossible to board. And you could get, 20, 30 cannon on them that had maybe a 200 to 300 yard range. They were 100 feet long, these ships. Sulfur gas they were able to throw. They had iron spikes, 26 cannon. There you go. Pretty fascinating stuff.
Then his spies reported to him that the Japanese were anchored at Sachun. This was too near his personal headquarters for comfort, so it was time he tested out the turtle ship. It was time he drove them off. But when his tiny fleet of 26 ships arrived outside Sachun, he saw that the Japanese arquebusiers had taken up positions along the cliffs above the harbor. If he were to attack, they could pour down fire on his ships.
Men that never should have been there in the first place if the guy in command, as we saw in the last episode, had done his job and prevented the landings in the first place. There's only so much you can do with the Navy when there's men on land. So I don't know how he's going to get out of this, but I'm curious to see.
He pondered this for a moment. Then he sent a small detachment to sail within sight of the Japanese fleet. Once they were sure the Japanese had spotted them, they turned and fled. And the Japanese gave chase. But the retreat was feigned. As soon as the Japanese fleet entered open water, Yi fell upon them with his entire force. His turtle ship plowed into the middle of the Japanese armada. Cannon fire rang out from all sides. Ships splintered and burned in the setting sun. The Japanese tried to close in, but they couldn't manage to board the covered turtle ship. With the Korean warships surrounding them and the turtle ship in their midst, the Japanese fought a hopeless battle until all 13 of the ships that had pursued the Koreans to open water were at the bottom of the sea.
So this tactic is one that has been used throughout history, this idea of faking a retreat. Some argue that that's what William the Conqueror used at Hastings. We don't really know for sure. We've talked about that recently. It may have been a legit retreat on the left of the Norman French lines that led to that, but some people argue it was done on purpose to draw the Anglo-Saxons out. Regardless of whether it was done on purpose or not, it worked. It works here. It was used in the Southern theater of the American Revolutionary War against the British, where you put, there's a kind of a fictionalized version of it in the movie The Patriot, where they put the militia out front, where Cornwallis has very little respect for the militia. The militia gets a shot or two off, and then they start to retreat, and then the British pursue, only to come up over the hill and run into the main continental line of the American army, and they just shred the British. So it's a common tactic, and it worked beautifully here.
Not a single Korean vessel was lost. After the battle, as his commanders gathered for a debriefing, Yi loosed his coat, pulled out a sword, and dug out a bullet that had lodged in his shoulder. His sub-commanders were amazed. To maintain morale, Yi had let no one know that he'd been injured in the fight. But as they all sat dumbfounded, Yi simply began to brief them on what to do in case of a counterattack. The next day...
So, wait. My man has a bullet in him, doesn't let on that he's been shot during the entire battle. As soon as it's over, he takes off his armor, digs the bullet out, and, okay, let's talk about strategy for the next part of the fight. That's pretty tough, man. That is hardcore. I like that a lot. And again, he loses no ships. This is the second straight battle he's lost no ships. And somebody commented yesterday and said that Admiral Yi, when he's in these battles, he's basically playing on like super easy mode so that you destroy the enemy without losing a single ship. That's kind of what he's doing here.
Local fishermen reported to Yi that the Japanese were anchored at Dongpo and that their men were sacking the city. Yi ordered his fleet to move with all haste. He would not let another Japanese slaughter go unanswered. When they reached the harbor city of Dongpo, he once again smashed through the enemy line with his turtle ship, positioned it right next to the enemy flagship, and buried shot after shot in its side. With his turtle ship in their midst, the enemy couldn't maneuver, and because the turtle ship had heavy guns on all sides, it couldn't be flanked. It simply loosed salvo after salvo at everything around it. And while the turtle ship caused chaos, the rest of the Korean ships surrounded the Japanese and trapped them in the harbor. At the height of the battle, one of Yi Sun-shin's sub-commanders, Kwon-jun, stood upon the deck of his vessel, drew his bow, and loosed an arrow at the enemy admiral. The shot found its mark.
Wow.
Two of his men then leapt upon the enemy flagship and cut off the Japanese admiral's head. Seeing their commander's head held aloft, the Japanese were thrown into a panic.
This is nuts. This is absolutely nuts what's happening, and I love every bit of it. These guys are not supposed to stand a chance against the Japanese. They've been just wiping the floor with the Korean army, and they've landed almost without opposition, but now all of a sudden this stuff's happening. Their guy gets shot with an arrow and then beheaded, their admiral. So this is a combination of two things. This is the brilliance of Admiral Yi's tactics. It's actually several things. It's his commanders carrying those tactics out effectively, but it's also the technology that they've got. You're not going to have many opportunities like this to have this kind of an advantage, because obviously once your enemies have seen that you have this kind of technology, they're going to start to want to replicate it. That's what happens in warfare. You probably got a couple of years of window here to do this, and at least in this war against the Japanese use it, but eventually I think they would probably come back with something different.
Command broke down, and in the chaos, Yi's ships sank the Japanese vessels one by one. As night fell and the Koreans withdrew, not a single Japanese ship remained. 2 days later, another Korean fleet, a fleet that was supposed to have joined them before any of this began but ran behind, finally rendezvoused with Yi, bringing his squadron up to 51 ships in total. With this larger force, he began to chase down rumors of another anchored Japanese fleet sacking a Korean town. The rumor turned out to be true, and again, Yi pounced upon the Japanese while they were disorganized, plundering a town. Again, Yi sent his turtle ship into their midst, and again he used a feigned retreat to lure them out into open water, although this time he did it to keep the Japanese from fleeing to shore if they were defeated. Again they followed, and again, upon his signal, his fleet turned upon their pursuers. Again the Japanese admiral fell in the battle, and Japanese morale broke. Again.
And this works because he's attacking separate fleets, and there's obviously been no way for them to communicate with one another to say, hey, this is what he's doing, don't fall for the same trick. But obviously that's not able to be done, so he's able to use the same tactic repeatedly.
Again, the Koreans trapped the fleeing vessels, and again, the Japanese fleet, 26 ships in all, was destroyed, without a single loss for Yi's forces. Turtle Ship was OP. Upon hearing of all this, Hideyoshi was furious. He was so close to conquering Korea. His men had taken Pyongyang. The Korean court had been driven all the way to a tiny border village. Any further and the King of Korea wouldn't even be on Korean soil anymore. There was only one province he had not yet been able to overrun, Chola, where Yi was based. And without control of the sea, he couldn't resupply his massive army in the field. Yi must be destroyed. The order was given. There would be no more land raids from his navy until Yi's fleet was at the bottom of the Tsushima Strait. He ordered his admirals to pool their forces and to form a massive fleet to sweep aside this admiral that was causing him so much pain. The three main Japanese admirals were to gather their fleets in Busan, but the admiral with the largest fleet, Wakisaka Yasuharu, decided that bringing the fleets together was taking too long. Side note, if you watched our Sengoku Jidai series, this is one of the men who would eventually betray Ishida at the Battle of Sekigahara. Anyway, eager for glory and unwilling to wait for the rest of the Japanese forces, he set out with his 73 ships.
Mistake.
I mean, why wait? He had 73 of the best ships in the Japanese fleet, and he knew Yi's armada, however devastating they might have been so far, was a small force.
But it had wiped out 2 Japanese fleets without losing a single ship. How arrogant do you have to be? Wait for the rest of the fleet.
But Yi hadn't been idle after his last battle. He'd been drilling his men in new tactics and constructing additional ships. With these new additions, his fleet now numbered 56, and most importantly, with 2 new turtle ships he could bring to bear. On July 7th, 1592, a local farmer came to tell Yi that he had seen a huge Japanese armada, at least 70 ships strong, in the Kyonerang Strait. Yi had his fleet there by the next day. Knowing that he couldn't maneuver in the strait, Yi sent out 6 of his ships to lure the Japanese, and sure enough, the entire Japanese force followed at all haste.
Fell for it again.
This time, the Japanese faced yet another surprise. This technique of luring out the Japanese had been working so well that Yi had trained his men in a special formation called the Crane's Wing, where they would form a U around the enemy vessels that chased his ships, compressing them from all sides, making them easy targets, and leaving them no room to maneuver. The Crane's Wing descended. The sound of cannon fire ripped the air. One of the largest naval battles in world history raged for hours. But when the smoke cleared, 47 of the Japanese ships were sunk and 12 were captured. Only 14 of them escaped to the harbor at Busan. And still, not a single Korean ship was lost.
He's playing on easy mode. He is playing on easy mode. He just took on a navy that had a fleet that had more ships than him. You saw what happened. This is nuts. This is absolutely nuts.
The next day, Yi was informed of the location of the other 2 admirals' fleets. They were anchored together at Angolpo. Yi saw the opportunity for a decisive blow, and so he set his vessels, fresh off the last battle, towards another attack. This time, though, no matter what he tried, the Japanese refused to be lured out of their position, so Yi sent his ships in small assault squads.
So now this is going to be a good test of his command ability, because he's not able to use the strategy that has worked. So now he has to adapt. He has to adjust. Can he do that and still be effective?
Using their superior range to hammer the largest of the Japanese ships, then moving clear so another squad could circle in and fire. The battle was long and bloody. Though still none of Yi's ships were sunk, between the action outside of Kyonerang and the Battle of Angolpo, hundreds of his sailors were wounded. It was the most damage the Japanese had done to Yi's fleet to date. But the majority of the Japanese fleet in the harbor was destroyed. Only a few ships remained, and these Yi ordered not to be touched, because many of the Japanese soldiers had fled to the nearby shore, and, as he said, many brigands escaped into the mountains where local inhabitants have taken refuge. If all the Japanese ships were to be burned, the brigands would massacre Korean citizens in revenge. As he expected, instead of slaughtering the peasants and...
That's smart, and that shows restraint on his part, because if he had been like some of these other commanders, he would have been going in for the glory, let me destroy another Japanese fleet. But he's using his brains, he's using his intelligence, and he's thinking ahead strategically of what the outcome would be. And that's the sign of a great strategist, is that you're not just thinking about the here and now. You're thinking, what are the consequences of my actions? What are the possible outcomes depending on the choices that I make? And you're thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead. That's how you last long term as an effective commander.
In the hills, the Japanese boarded their remaining boats and slipped away in the night. 6 days later, upon hearing the news of these calamitous defeats, Hideyoshi ordered all offensive naval operations to cease. From now on, the Japanese Navy would only guard the passage to Busan. And so, with one stroke, Yi destroyed all of Hideyoshi's hopes for invading China. And without being able to resupply from the sea, even the Japanese efforts on the Korean peninsula were in jeopardy. The supply lines to the forces occupying Pyongyang were sorely stretched, and pursuing the Korean court any further became effectively impossible. Though the Korean army had been beaten on land time and time again, Yi had saved Korea. But the war wasn't over. Join us next time for Yi's attempt to land a finishing blow, treachery, and perhaps the greatest last stand in naval history.
So, fascinating. I mean, this man did. He literally single-handedly changed the outcome of that war, and probably the outcome of the nation for the foreseeable future. That's impressive stuff to be able to pull off. So let's go ahead right in to part 4 now.
Last time, we left Yi storming through the waters south of Korea, savaging the Japanese fleet wherever he went. He had driven them first to consolidate their forces to try to thwart him, and then, finally, to give up on offensive naval operations entirely, restricting their fleets to just defending the vital supplies coming in at Busan. Now it was in this last harbor that Yi would attack them. In the 2 months since the Battle of Angulpo, Yi had trained his men, reinforced his fleet, and tried to rationalize the structure of Korean Naval Command. Now, on September 1st, 1592, he was ready to take on the combined Japanese armada at Busan. His fleet of 166 ships set out to destroy the nearly 500 Japanese ships awaiting them in Busan Bay.
So he's got, 3 times the number of ships that he's had in some of these previous battles, but he's also facing 5 or 6 times, probably maybe 6 or 7 times as many ships as what he faced before. And now he's got to go on the attack. And you would think Japan's got all of the advantages here, except one, they don't have Yi.
He caught a few stragglers along the way, but the Japanese had finally learned from their past encounters with him. They were holed up in the harbor now, and while Yi's ships were able to fire into the harbor from outside Japanese cannon range, he couldn't find an opening to get close enough to achieve the type of complete victory he craved. As long as the Japanese were in that harbor, they were protected by the surrounding troops and cannon on the shore. By the end of the day, Yi's fleet had destroyed 130 ships, and the Japanese hadn't sunk a single vessel, but the Japanese forces still held the all-important harbor of Busan. Yi had not been able to break their last line of supply. Now they'd be able to re-entrench and reinforce the harbor. As winter set in and the campaign season slowed down, the situation on the ground changed as well. An army from China had finally arrived in the north, and by January they had driven the Japanese out of Pyongyang. All over the country, the Japanese started to fall back, unable to sustain their lengthy lines of supply due to Yi's bottling up of their navy. By April, Seoul was retaken as well, and Busan served as the last great Japanese stronghold.
So, wow, I mean, this is, now you got the Chinese coming in to help out. They've pushed back on land. It's actually kind of fascinating to see the parallels between this and the Korean War in the early 1950s, where it goes all the way one direction, comes all the way back the other direction, and just extremes on one side and then the other as far as where the front lines are.
Anchoring their control on southern Korea. By August, Yi was promoted to Supreme Commander of the Korean Army and moved his base to the island of Honsando, where he had previously used his crane wing formation to crush the Japanese offensive fleet. Again and again, Yi petitioned the court for Marines so that he could resume naval operations, because his fleet couldn't attack the Japanese so long as they stayed defended under their shore guns, and without Marines, he couldn't dislodge the shore batteries in order to follow up with the naval attack. But the Korean army was still in disarray at this point. Some of the most significant military gains on land were actually being made by guerrilla forces and the righteous armies of Buddhist monks. And what
the righteous armies of Buddhist monks. That is so cool. I love that. I've always been fascinated by the concept of the warrior monk, or the warrior priest. In Western culture. And you see this, for example, if you've ever seen the show Vikings, Jonathan Rhys-Meyers plays one of these warrior priest types. Bishop Aemund, I think was his name. Just very cool, kind of, reconciling the whole faith aspect, but also being a warrior for God and, those kinds of things. So this is pretty cool. So interesting that they recognize, kudos to the military authorities in Korea for recognizing Admiral Yi, so much so his prowess that they put him in charge of the army as well. Too bad he doesn't really have much of an army to fight with.
Little of the regular army there was not already deployed on the main offensive with the Chinese was simply not up to the task Yi needed. And so his fleet sat, patrolled the waters, and kept the Japanese from breaking out of Busan. They would not get to engage in another major battle for some time. So instead, Yi focused on turning his island base into a production center. With the country ravaged by war and most of the working-age men conscripted into the army or the navy, the central government couldn't provide Yi's forces with the food, lumber, or weapons he needed to keep his men fed and his fleet in top shape. So he invited refugees to come to his island. He would protect them if they would work the land.
Wow.
At first they were just producing grain, but soon they were harvesting salt and timber. Then the production facilities grew to...
So salt you need for a couple things. Number one, it helps preserve food, but it also is an essential ingredient, or a derivative of salt is an ingredient in gunpowder, saltpeter. So it's important for a lot of different things. And this was true for hundreds of years afterwards. In fact, some of the little-known battles that take place in the American Civil War take place when troops out of eastern Kentucky were raiding Saltville in southwestern Virginia, because the salt mines in Saltville, Virginia were key to helping support the work of the Confederate Army.
Handle boat building and uniform manufacturing. Soon there was a full-fledged R&D wing on the island, and great forges to produce goods of iron. The first truly successful Korean muskets were forged here by Yi's research team. But as Yi was making his navy self-sufficient, the land war in Korea slowly ground to a stalemate.
Again, I can't help but see the parallels to a video game here. I mean, Yi is basically playing, he's playing a game. He's got his enemy bottled up. He's been playing on easy mode anyway, but now he's working on research and he's trying to build up. He's trying to do the Hearts of Iron thing where you contain your enemy, make sure that you can outproduce him and get the technology going and get your production up, and then just overwhelm him afterwards. I love it.
And peace talks began. The talks wore on for 3.5 years, until in September 1596, negotiations broke down and Hideyoshi prepared a second invading force of 141,500 men to head to the shores of Korea. As this new invasion force was setting sail, the Korean court received a letter from one of the Japanese commanders, in which he appeared to be selling out one of his counterparts, telling the Koreans exactly where his hated rival's fleet would be sailing, and suggesting that if only Admiral Yi Sun-shin would sail there, he could wipe them out and do everybody a favor.
Now, my gut would say they're trying to trick you. They're trying to draw you into a situation where they can wipe you out. So I don't know if I would have trusted this.
Now, Admiral Yi heard this and laughed.
Yep.
Yeah, nice try. He refused the order to sail his fleet into an obvious Japanese trap. But Yi's childhood friend, Ryu Sung-young, had enemies in court, and when they heard of Yi's refusal to follow orders, they seized on this opportunity and had Yi tried for treason. Ryu could do nothing to save him.
What?
Yi was ordered to return to Seoul for his punishment. His replacement as head of the navy would be Won Kyun. This was the guy who'd sat and done nothing when the Japanese ships first invaded, and then promptly scuttled his own fleet. A fleet 4 times as large as the one Yi had been using to inflict such heavy losses on their enemies. Yi was nearly sentenced to death for his insubordination, but there were still those in court who saw his value, and though they couldn't save him entirely, they did save his life. He was once more reduced to the rank of a common soldier and sent off to fight with one of the armies. But not long after he arrived at the army, the Japanese tried the same trick again. They sent the court a letter, this time informing them of a large transport fleet that was on its way, and saying how easy it would be to pick off these transports if they hurried. Won Kyun was ordered to intercept this juicy target, and he immediately set sail with every ship Yi had
probably
built.
got owned.
But when he reached the waters near Busan, he was shocked to find not an unarmed transport convoy, but a massive war fleet of...
You complete, utter morons. How many times does this guy have to prove himself before you listen to him?
500 ships. Despite this, and the exhaustion his men faced from traveling so quickly, Won Kyun ordered a head-on assault. The winds picked up, and a gale began to form. Won Kyun couldn't keep his fleet together. Soon, some 30 Korean ships were burning, having drifted close enough to the enemy that, for the first time in the war, the Japanese could deploy their preferred form of naval warfare, boarding parties.
Ugh.
In a panic, Wonkyun ordered a retreat and fled to the island of Kadokdo, where he ordered his men off the ships to resupply. What he hadn't realized was that this island was under Japanese control. As his men searched for fresh water, they were set upon by the Japanese island garrison and slaughtered.
This guy wasn't just a bad replacement for Yi. He was absolutely incompetent. Oh my god, he could not possibly be more opposite of what Admiral Yi was.
Those who escaped fled back to the ships without any of the supplies they desperately needed. Then the fleet just sat there, deflated and listless. Commanders asked for orders, but Wonkyun had none. Though Busan itself was not far away, he didn't even send out scouts or reposition his fleet. Then, on the night of July 15th, guided by a full moon, the Japanese struck. Wonkyun's forces were in a disadvantageous position. His men were fatigued from lack of supply and demoralized by their loss and the days of waiting. Caught off guard at night and without any sort of plan, they were no match for the organized and coordinated Japanese assault. Even abandoning ship couldn't save them, as those that made it to one of the nearby shores found themselves face to face with the Japanese army, who were silently waiting there for any stragglers who might try to escape, and were quickly cut down. Of the fleet Yi had so carefully built, only 12 ships escaped, saved by one of the sub-commanders who had tried to warn Wonkyun of the danger they faced. 157 Korean ships were lost that day.
So Yi goes in battle after battle, doesn't lose a single ship. This guy gets into one battle and loses the entire fleet. Oh, this is just frustrating and infuriating and heartbreaking.
Including every turtle ship ever built. So with only 12 ships left in the entire Navy, who did Korea call upon? Who else? But mere days after reinstating Yi as admiral, the court informed him that they were disbanding the Navy. Yi responded thusly: "This humble subject still has 12 ships. However small the number may be, I solemnly swear I will be able to defend the sea if I prepare myself for death to resist the enemy." And so...
This guy was hardcore. Korea did not deserve him. Korea, you did not deserve this guy. I would have said, like 3 times before this, I would have said, screw you. Find somebody else, because you're just gonna turn on me in the end. Oh my gosh, good for him.
So they let him. So Yi plotted and pondered where he would make his last stand. This would be it. This one decision would seal the fate of Korea. He studied charts and tides, and finally came to decide on Myeongyang, the Roaring Strait. This particular strait had a strong current, but unknown to the Japanese, its current had a strange property. Every 3 hours, it changed direction. It was upon this unusual current that Yi would gamble everything. On September 16th, the Japanese fleet, looking to destroy the final remnant of the Korean Navy, found Yi's scouts at the mouth of the strait. They chased the scouts into the strait, and that's when Yi fell upon them. Yi's flagship dashed into their midst, roaring cannon and tearing through Japanese timber. But his ship fought alone. The rest of his navy, possessed by fear at facing such a large force, had lagged behind. Eventually, though, seeing the havoc Yi's ship was wreaking on the enemy, they took heart. Messengers were sent from boat to boat with a mix of inspirational words, threats, and the hope of victory. And soon, the rest of Yi's tiny armada dove into the fray. Then, a stroke of luck. The enemy flagship was blown apart by friendly fire, and the Japanese began to waver. Some of their ships began to turn about to fall back. And it was just at this moment that the water's current turned. The strait was too narrow for all the Japanese ships to maneuver around each other. And with the current roaring against them, ship slammed into ship. They tried in vain to retreat, tangled, ships smashing into one another, screams and chaos, and over it all, the roaring water. With the current now on their side, the Koreans gave chase, laying into enemy ships on either side, a hail of fire and arrows. The Japanese boats burnt and sank. 133 vessels had come to crush this tiny remnant of Korean Navy, and 31 of them wouldn't be returning. Yi, even when facing odds of 10 to 1, had once again not lost a single ship.
Playing on easy mode.
Yi's victory spread. As his tiny fleet sailed, one by one, other ships began to show up. Ships that had been thought lost. Ships that had been hiding after the previous disaster under Wonkyun.
And now that they know Yi's back in command, they're ready to come out and fight. Oh, this is cool.
These ships now came to join Yi's tiny armada. Refugees flocked to where Yi's ships were anchored, willingly giving him food, cloth, and iron. And perhaps most importantly, the Chinese, who had mostly limited their naval efforts to guarding ports until now, decided that they could work with the Korean Navy and take the offensive. And so we'll leave Yi rebuilding the Korean Navy until next week, when we see the Japanese invasion ended for good.
Wow, dang. I mean, the dude, he was using a cheat code. That's the only thing I can say. He was using a cheat code. So impressive. I cannot wait to learn the rest of his story. And then I'm going to go find a good book on him. If you have a good book to recommend, please let me know. I know there are a couple of movies about him too. I want to learn more about this guy. This is really fascinating stuff. I hope you are enjoying this as much as I am. Please use the comment section below and let me know your thoughts on the stuff we've talked about today. And we will be back tomorrow for the conclusion of this story. Thanks for watching.